Conscience protection. We'll hear from a Catholic nurse forced to help in an abortion. Now she's fighting for legislation. Asia tour. President Trump calls for the denuclearization of North Korea. No buts about it. The Vatican announces changes in its stores, banning the sale of cigarettes. And heavenly bodies. The theme of next year's Met Gala is announced, where fashion meets faith. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, November 9th, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. One-on-one with Kellyanne Conway, the counselor to the president, is calling on Congress to pass pro-life legislation. White House correspondent Mark Irons joins us with more. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. I just spoke to Kellyanne Conway moments ago. We know President Trump is pro-life, but I asked her, what is he personally doing to push the pro-life agenda?
I would just remind everybody that candidate Trump is the same as President Trump. He had signed a letter committing to do 4 different things, and one of them was the 20-week ban on abortions, because after all, the pain capable or halfway point, as it's called, this is the point after which in a woman's pregnancy, nonpartisan doctors and scientists say a fetus can feel pain. And we've seen it make its way through the House. We see the Senate considering it. The president has committed to signing that into law if it reaches his desk. At the same time, we see all these stories on the 1-year anniversary of his election and almost the 1-year anniversary of his inauguration, where people are saying he's the most pro-life president in modern history. He put Neil Gorsuch on the United States Supreme Court. He's nominating pro-life men and women up and down the federal bench. He has a vice president who has a very solid pro-life record in elective office as Congress and in the governorship of Indiana. And on day 2 or 3 of his presidency, reinstated Mexico City policy and then directed Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to go beyond that. And so it's been very heartening to many pro-lifers to see that this is a president who's made good on his commitment to the pro-life cause.
She went on to say she hopes the House and Senate will follow through on pro-life legislation. She also called to mind the last presidential debate in the 2016 election. She says President Trump gave the most impassioned defense of life from a presidential debate podium in history when he questioned Hillary Clinton's views on late-term abortion. Conway tells me that many rank-and-file Democrats don't even support it. Lauren?
Mark, I was in the room in Las Vegas when he did that. You could have heard a pin drop. And it's remarkable that more than a year later, she recalls that moment so vividly.
That's right. It left an indelible mark on her memory. After my interview was over, she wanted to go back and talk about that moment. She says pro-lifers, including her, will never forget it.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. A Catholic nurse forced to help carry out an abortion shares her heartbreak on Capitol Hill. She joins lawmakers supporting the Conscience Protection Act. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi introduces us to nurse Kathy DiCarlo.
8 years later, the memories still flood her mind.
I'll never forget that day as I watched in horror as the doctor dismembered and removed the baby's bloody limbs. And I had to account for all the pieces. I still have nightmares about that day.
Kathy DiCarlo of New York City says her hospital gave her an ultimatum: assist in the abortion or be fired. To stop this from happening to others, Representative Diane Black, a Republican from Tennessee and also a nurse, is sponsoring the Conscience Protection Act.
We are simply asking to protect the fundamental rights of Americans. No one ever should be forced to participate in killing an unborn child. The legislation is about giving victims of abortion discrimination the ability to defend their rights in court.
Congressman Andy Harris is a Republican from Maryland and a doctor. He backs the bill.
The fact of the matter is we have to allow conscience protection for any healthcare worker who chooses not to participate in what they view as the taking of a human life.
In 2016, the House passed a previous version of the Conscience Protection Act. All Democrats, except for 3, voted against it.
This is a hypocritical bill that would make it even harder for women to obtain the reproductive health care they need.
But Kathy says she wants the freedom to focus on caring for patients, not worrying about compromising her Catholic faith.
I always believed in the sanctity of human life, and I became a nurse to help people, not to destroy life.
Having passed the House, tacked on to 2018 appropriations, lawmakers are pushing for the Senate to pick up the Conscience Protection Act. On the campaign trail, President Trump promised Catholic vote he'd sign the bill if it makes it to his desk. Lauren?
How are pro-life advocates getting the word out about this bill?
New York Cardinal Timothy Dolan is speaking out. He teamed up with Baptist leader Russell Moore and wrote an op-ed in USA Today in support of the Conscience Protection Act. They say even those who disagree with them on abortion should respect that being pro-choice means letting people choose not to help with abortions.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. A woman in Alabama says Roy Moore, the Republican nominee for next month's U.S. Senate election, made inappropriate advances and had sexual contact with her when she was 14. The Washington Post is reporting these allegations made by the woman. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says if the report is true, Moore should step aside from the race. The Moore campaign called the report the very definition of fake news. Vice President Pence says the evil that descended on that small church in Texas where 26 people were gunned down didn't silence their faith.
And it's especially humbling to be with the precious families of the fallen and injured.
Pence also calls the attack evil and called the gunman, Devin Kelley, deranged. The vice president says the blame for Sunday's massacre rests solely with Kelley and the Air Force bureaucracy. The Department of Defense is investigating why Air Force officials failed to report Kelley's criminal record and history of mental illness. Wyatt Goolsbee reports from the Pentagon. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. The Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, says the Air Force takes responsibility for not properly registering the fingerprints of Devin Kelley to the FBI. Wilson told reporters in a briefing that just wrapped up she does not know if there are other cases, but she says the military is working to find out what happened.
Since Sunday night, the Air Force Inspector General has talked to about 100 people involved in this case. We are looking at all of our databases, and if we have problems that we find, we'll fix them. Our approach here is to act in accordance with our values, which include integrity and excellence.
Wilson says Kelley was clearly a serious problem in the Air Force. While stationed in New Mexico, he made death threats against superior officers. Police reports also indicate he escaped from a mental health facility in 2012. That same year, he was formally ousted from the Air Force for assaulting his ex-wife and her son. Wilson admits if Kelley's problems had been properly reported, it would have likely prevented him from buying the guns he used in Sunday's attack. After the Texas massacre, defense officials are now conducting a review of every branch of the military to make sure the National Crime Information Center has the most up-to-date information. Lauren?
Wyatt, the vice president says they have about 100 FBI agents in Sutherland Springs, Texas, investigating this shooting. What progress are they making?
Well, Lauren, we know that authorities have reviewed video from inside the church when the shooting happened. The church records every service and puts it online. So investigators say the video that they got is graphic, but consistent with what survivors had reported. So the FBI is still trying to gain access in the meantime to the shooter's iPhone, but has not asked Apple for any help in getting data off of that device. And finally, we've also learned tonight that the pastor of the church has announced he is planning to demolish the building and build a new one. He says right now it just hurts too much. Lauren.
Oh, what terrible, terrible news. Thank you so much, Wyatt Goolsbee, reporting from the Pentagon. President Trump is in China and calls for help from China's President Xi Jinping with the nuclear threat of North Korea.
And I am calling on China and your great president to hopefully work on it very hard. I know one thing about your president. If he works on it hard, it will happen.
The two also talked trade, with President Trump saying China has taken advantage of the U.S., but he, quote, doesn't blame them. The world remains on edge over the nuclear threat from North Korea, but a Vatican diplomat believes the solution may come from Pope Francis.
He keeps saying we need to build channels of communication and not walls.
The Vatican will host a two-day nuclear conference starting Friday. The goal is to talk about how to lessen the threat from North Korea and to eliminate nuclear weapons worldwide. A Cuban official says the Trump administration's decision yesterday to reimpose travel restrictions in order to bring down the communist regime has never worked.
Has it happened in the past? Never, ever. So it hasn't worked. It doesn't work. It won't work.
The Trump administration is following through with its promise to roll back many of President Obama's Cuba policies. Catholic officials in Sydney are preparing to buy a golf course to use as a cemetery. The plan is a response to the city's lack of burial space. Reports say Sydney may run out in 30 years. The golf course will cost $24 million, but would provide room for 60,000 graves. No buts about it. The Vatican will no longer sell cigarettes to employees. Pope Francis has decided to ban the sales of tobacco in its duty-free shops and supermarkets starting January 1st. This cuts out about $11 million of revenue. Alan Holdren is EWTN's Rome bureau chief. Alan, what reasons did the Vatican give for making this decision?
Well, Lauren, they said that the Holy Father decided to stop selling these cigarettes within the Vatican to employees because they cannot contribute to something that hurts people's health. The statement from the Vatican cited the number at 7 million deaths that the World Health Organization says of people that died from smoking-related causes in the last year. They also said that they do make a profit. They have made a profit from the sales of cigarettes, but they can't continue to do that. They can't gain a profit from something that puts people's lives at risk.
And what are Vatican employees saying about this? Happy, not happy?
Well, I caught up to one today. He said that the same store that sells these cigarettes also sells high-end jewelry that is beyond the reach of the normal Vatican employees. There are also Armani suits that are sold in this same place. He said he doesn't even know who those things are being sold to. The cigarettes come at a discounted rate, sold in the same place. He said that people would in general be very understanding of this, although smoking will not be prohibited there within the Vatican. It's just the sale of those cigarettes.
Only the sale. I didn't know that there were shops within the Vatican. How many are there? And what do they sell?
Well, Lauren, the Vatican is a sovereign state. There are people who reside within the Vatican, a lot of employees that go to shop there. Besides this shop that sells also technology, cameras, computers, things like that, there are also other shops like a pharmacy that sells even pharmaceutical products that you can't find in Italy. There is a supermarket that sells fresh foods as well as chocolate, wine. It's surprising for people to see these things when they step into the Vatican, but it's just like any other supermarket that you'd find outside of the Vatican walls. You can also find a post office there. There are all kinds, even the newspaper that's there. It is its own little state with all of the services that come with it.
Okay, well, no more smoking. You can smoke, but you can't buy.
That's right.
Okay, Alan Holdren, EWTN Rome Bureau Chief. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren.
Coming up, honoring Capitol Hill police officers.
I wouldn't be here today without the heroism and their bravery.
A congressman praises 5 officers who saved his life. And the U.S. Embassy in Israel. Is it moving? Pope Francis receives the credentials of San Luin, the ambassador of Myanmar to the Holy See. It's the first time the country has had representation in the Vatican. About 1% of Myanmar's 51 million people are Catholic. Congressional leaders joined the U.S. Capitol Police in honoring 5 officers with the Medal of Honor in recognition of their actions last June. That's when a gunman opened fire on a baseball practice in Virginia.
These 5 brave men and women prevented what would have been mass execution A lot of members of Congress that are here today wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be here today without the heroism and their bravery.
Louisiana Representative Steve Scalise, who was the most seriously wounded in the attack, shook hands with each of the officers following the presentation. A deadline is fast approaching on whether or not to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the country's capital. On December 1st, President Trump has to either announce a move or delay the action by another 6 months.
To this day, 50 years after the liberation and reunification of Jerusalem, the State of Israel, one of America's strongest allies, is the only nation in the world in which the American government refuses to locate its embassy in the host nation's chosen capital.
Congressman Ron DeSantis organized a hearing on the issue this week on Capitol Hill. Critics believe that this move would hurt the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. We're joined by Congressman Ron DeSantis, a Republican from Florida, the chair of the House Oversight Committee's National Security Subcommittee. Have you talked to the president? Do you expect him to finally lift the waiver and approve the move?
Well, I spoke to the White House last week in anticipation of the hearing. They were actually very supportive of the hearing. The president remains committed to relocating our embassy to Jerusalem, but I didn't receive any commitments about when that will be done, whether there will be another waiver, and if so, how many more waivers. I just thought it was important that still this year, 2017, 50 years after Jerusalem was liberated, that we keep a spotlight on this issue.
Given the fact that Presidents Bush, Clinton, Obama all said that they would like to move the embassy to Jerusalem, but it never happened, how likely is this?
I think if you look back at that, people are saying, oh, we can't move the embassy because the sky will fall, it'll endanger the peace process, all this other stuff. The fact of the matter is, for 25 years, this peace process has failed because Palestinian Arabs do not recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So I think those excuses are kind of tired at this point. We keep hearing why you can't do it, and eventually that just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So those old excuses, I think, are over. I think moving it would actually have a positive impact on the facts on the ground there. But the bottom line is, if that's the line of thinking that continues, then you're not really in favor of relocating the embassy.
The Arabs told President Trump that this would cause unrest in the region. I'm showing a map right now to our viewers of where Tel Aviv is located in comparison to Jerusalem. Do you not believe that this could be a real threat?
I took the trip there in March to look at the existing sites that we have in Jerusalem, and I'm convinced that if you did it right using one of the existing sites, that there is adequate security, and in fact, I think potentially could be much better security than what you have in Tel Aviv right now with the embassy in a very populated part of town. At the end of the day, though, you can't let some of the most extreme elements in the Middle East veto American policy. When the Jerusalem Embassy Act was passed in 1995, the waiver authority there was only if America's national security interests were jeopardized by moving it. It did not give Jordan or Saudi Arabia or any other country a veto over where we locate our American embassy.
Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman Ron DeSantis of Florida.
Thank you.
Tonight on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly, Representative Steve King of Iowa says that he supports making babies born to illegal immigrants citizens if the alternative is abortion.
If I have to choose between automatic citizenship for babies born to illegal parents in America or abortion, I'm going to let them go ahead and have the automatic citizenship.
King is the sponsor of the Heartbeat Protection Act. You can see more of Catherine Zeltner's interview with him tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern on EWTN. Pro-Life Weekly re-airs Sunday morning at 10. Up next, millions starving. We talk to a South Sudan charity about sanctions, terror, and U.S. policy. Catholic couture. Amal Clooney and Rihanna host fashion's biggest night, with designer gowns paying homage to Catholicism. Today, the church celebrates the feast of the dedication of St. John Lateran Basilica in Rome. The church is the cathedral of the Diocese of Rome and is named after St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist. Lateran comes from the family that owned the land where the basilica sits. The world's youngest nation continues to starve. 4 years of civil war in South Sudan leaves more than half of the population experiencing severe hunger. While the U.S. has lifted sanctions in Sudan, food is not reaching people in need in either country, and the government is using food as a weapon of war. Joining me now is David Detoney, Director of Operations for the Sudan Relief Fund, providing food and schools and hospitals there. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
The Trump administration is continuing this nuanced approach by lifting these sanctions. And I think that one thing we would love to know from you is it working?
I think that on the ground, it's not working yet. The bombs have stopped falling in the Nuba Mountains where we work predominantly, which is a good thing. The reality, though, throughout the country is nothing's changed. In the United States, if it exercises political leverage, can help bring a lasting peace in the Nuba Mountains, but that is a work in progress.
Well, according to the State Department, the country is still a state sponsor of terrorism, and the reason that it is still on that list is because of its human rights violations and its religious persecution. Tell us about that piece of it. I know that Open Doors, a nonprofit that helps Christians, says that there are nearly 2 million Christians in Sudan out of a population of 42 million who are being persecuted. How bad is it?
You know, there are worse places in the world, North Korea, where you're just going to be shot for being a Christian. But it's tough. You know, the Catholic bishops there was in the church that just had an ordination ceremony or installation for a bishop and in one part of the country, and they were driving back to Khartoum, and the president of the bishops' conference was there and several other bishops, and the security services stopped them. And they were not going to let them go to Khartoum because they're Christians. And so they eventually got out of it. But they're second-class citizens. They're viewed as a security threat in Sudan because it's a predominantly Muslim country, and it's been run for a long time by radical Muslim ideology.
U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, just visited South Sudan. Here's a picture of her getting off of the plane. She was there last week. In your opinion, did she accomplish anything?
Yes and no. I'll start off with the no. I think it was a lost opportunity. I would have preferred the Trump administration to meet at a high level and talk about ways that we can move forward and help the region and help them get out of the morass that they're in. It was helpful in that she sent a strong message of saying the behavior of the government and the conditions in South Sudan are no longer tolerable, and our patience is running out.
Thank you for the update on what is happening in that forgotten part of the world.
You're
David
welcome.
Detoney, Director of Operations for the Sudan Relief Fund. Finally tonight, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's 2018 Gala takes on a Catholic theme. Heavenly Bodies, Fashion and the Catholic Imagination will feature designs based on papal vestments on loan to the museum from the Sistine Chapel. The Gala's hosts include Amal and George Clooney and the singer Rihanna. It's going to highlight the role of religion and liturgical vestments in fashion. What could go wrong? For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless you.